Hello everyone. So in this video this is not a general disease update video. We're going to be talking about the 2024-2025 flu season that we just experienced about a few months ago. As we are slowly, but we will eventually enter the 2025-2026 flu season, so it's good to look back and understand the burden of influenza on the population of the United States, understand some reasons why that occurred, and then look at factors that led to it versus other years. Well, not necessarily other years, but more explaining how we got to where we were. Now, the exact genetic composition of the viruses that caused the flu waves this year, I will not get into because I'm not experienced enough in those fields, but eventually I will be. So I will mainly be talking about the burden according to CDC data. I'll also be showing, I think, the amount of cases that were recorded, or at least lab detections, positivity rate, and death rate. So we'll be discussing all of that today. So the preliminary estimated flu disease burden for 2024-25 flu season, the full list should come out in November. But from what we have right now, we know that influenza throughout the United States usually has a seasonal pattern to it, where during the summer it's practically absent, and then towards the back end of fall, we begin to see an increase, and then we have a sharp peak during the winter, and then a sharp decline as we enter spring, and then the virus tapers off as we enter late spring into summer. So for the preliminary results that we have for the flu season during the season, since October the 1st and then ending on May 17th, the CDC estimated that we had between 47 to 82 million flu infections, or illnesses. I'm not quite sure how they define this. If we're going to assume illnesses are infections, then we'll assume that's what it is. For flu visits, they estimate between 21 million to 37 million based on the Influenza Hospitalization Network, or fluserve.net. Based on hospitalizations, they estimated between 610,000 Americans and 1.3 million Americans were hospitalized with the flu over this season. And then between anywhere from 27,000 at the low end to 130,000 Americans died at the high end over this entire period. Now, each week is calculated differently because flu weeks, at least in the United States, there are about 52 weeks in a year. The CDC takes disease data weekly, week by week, and then tallies it up over time to give us an idea of how transmission is operating within the country. So based on the estimates here, each week CDC calculates a lower estimate and an upper estimate of flu-related hospitalizations that have occurred since the beginning of the season, October 1st, 2024. These are compared to the end of season estimates of flu-related hospitalizations from previous flu seasons, which they have listed down here. I'll actually zoom in as well, just so the screen looks normal. These calculations allow for a preliminary comparison of how in-season flu-related hospitalizations are tracking in relation to past seasons. This can help health officials to continue to manage impacts on healthcare systems and promote prevention measures. So, if we look at their estimate, because they don't have a final number yet, but if we look at their estimate, we can see that the vast majority of hospitalizations for influenza did not really grow until we hit January, and it did not really balloon until February, where the peak of the wave endured, and then towards the back end of the wave, this large separation here on the high end of 1.3 million and the bottom of around 600,000 is the end of the wave. So most likely, when the CDC does their full review of the severity of the season at the end of this year, around November, this number will probably be somewhere around 1 million hospitalizations, which, based on previous seasons, is higher than pretty much almost anything we've had, including recent seasons like 2023-2024, which was around 500,000 hospitalizations for the entire flu season. And then 2022-2023 was a bit below that at 366,000. I won't include 2021-2022 because that had less flu transmission due to COVID-19, due to the Omicron surge of COVID-19, in addition to we were still having, the government was still mandating masks and still doing protections against COVID-19 at the time, which were roughly disbanded as we entered March 2022 and fully disbanded as the year went on. So I will count 2022-2023 as that's when most people were unmasked and the virus was able to spread a lot more, viral strains rather. But I won't include 2021-22 season in this one because it's lower for a reason. And then if we look at previous flu seasons, 2017-2018, that's the previous high severity flu season that we've had, and that one was around 700,000 hospitalizations. You have the general just here, so I expect that when they do the full review, it should be somewhere around 1 million. Now, as for their in-season summary, I think I have a different page for it. They do list limitations here though. So their first limitation is cumulative rate of lab-confirmed flu-related hospitalizations. Not all flu cases can be reported, and not all of the population can be surveilled for disease accurately. So, based on this, not all cases will be reported, and some of them would have been delayed, and there might be underestimated because there has to be identification, right? Rates of lab for flu-related hospitalizations are adjusted for the frequency of flu testing as well, and sensitivity of flu diagnostic assays. However, data on testing practices during the current flu season are not available in real time. This is what I basically said. To make these assumptions from past flu seasons as a proxy, if more testing is being done compared to past flu seasons, these estimates may be inflated. For example, estimates of medical visits for flu-like illnesses are based on data from prior seasons, which may not be accurate if the severity of the illness patterns of health behavior have changed. Which for this particular season, they were not expecting such a severe season, but we've had one, so we can't really expect the same trends to hold true. Now, there's more stuff down here listed, but the general range of flu hospitalizations from 2010 to 2024, excluding 2020-21 season, was from around 120,000 to 710,000 flu hospitalizations, with the rough median being somewhere around 400,000. And there's an additional page here, and this is for the actual deaths and statistics. So the peak influenza-like illness rate nationally was 7.9%. That's high. That's not extreme. Not very high is what I call extreme. So very high would be somewhere around 10%. But this is what we had. So influenza-like illness started off generally normal and then generally low severity. And then once we got into December, at the first peak of the wave, the first peak, which was moderate severity, and then we had a little lull, and then we had a large jump up in severity towards the beginning of February, and then we see this decline slowly coming back in the spring, where the wave really starts to taper off. Same thing with hospitalizations. Not many hospitalizations in October, November, and December. At the end, into January, we see an increase in hospitalizations, but we really see the peak in February, where about 23.4 out of every 100,000 23.4 people out of 100,000 out of every 100,000 people were in the hospital with flu confirmed or estimated at this point, with the hospitalizations eventually after the flu peak dropping off pretty substantially afterward, although not as quickly as the increase, but still pretty substantial. And then percents of deaths caused by flu were low initially, as I've already mentioned, but as we entered January, they moved up past the 1% mark, which is the moderate severity, and then towards February, for almost all of February, we were about 2%. 2% of all deaths in the United States were from flu each week, with a peak value of 2.8%, and then a rapid decline as we enter March, and then less people were dying, and then below 1% of people were dying from the flu each week once we entered April. So there are more text lines here, but the main thing to go over here, and then I could go in-season flu indicators just to make it easier to see. Flu severity across all ages was high, and then these are general stats, and then by group it was like this. Now, when we actually look at the flu wave from a transmission perspective, not from a death or hospitalization perspective, although those are important, we can see generally the pattern of this flu wave was a bit wider than some other flu waves in the recent past. So this flu wave basically, it started around late November, which is typical. Flu seasons typically really kickstart in November, mid-November. So this one starting in late November and getting its act together in December is a bit later than normal, but not too out the ordinary. We have an initial increase, and then we have a large increase on the first wave through Christmas and into the New Year. They were just below high flu transmission, and then we have a slight decrease in mid-January, and then we have a very large increase into the very high territory in late January, and that sustains through the first 2 weeks of April before it starts declining slowly. Results declining at a slower rate than an increase, but still at a decent pace. We have a decent decline, and then by the time we entered in March, we were at moderate flu transmission, and the flu season effectively ended once we got into mid-April. Now, if we look at previous flu seasons, we could see that this wave is a bit wider in terms of its stature than other waves. The 2023-2024 wave, as we go into it, it had an earlier start than what we initially had here, and it peaked roughly around New Year's. But it did not get as high as this year's wave, but it did last a bit longer into the spring, where we had moderate to low sustained transmission edging in further into the spring, which makes more sense, because having a large wave where a large amount of people are infected typically leads to a sharper decline in infection rates later, because so many people were infected initially. Whereas in 2023, 2024, not as many people were infected initially, so there's more of the population to burn through later. In 2022-2023 season, we had a large wave that became high. Moderate severity season. Both of these were moderate severity seasons, except for our one that we are discussing, which is high severity. This one peaked in December, and then after December, it really fell off. It really fell off a cliff in terms of transmission. So by the time we entered February, we were at transmission levels that you would typically see of the flu, more so at the end of spring. Now, why did this wave get so high? There are multiple factors. So we could talk about, as I already mentioned, we could have talked about the actual viral strains, although I can't really get too much into that as I don't know. The main circulating viral strains during that time were H1N1 and H3N2. Those are the two predominant strains of influenza circulating at the peak of the wave. Now, something I will bring up to your attention is the concept of viral interference. So when people are infected, when there's a large percentage or proportion of the virus within a population, it can crowd out the other viruses within that population as well. So what that effectively means is that, for example, if influenza is high, then that implies that diseases like COVID-19, RSV, rhinovirus, or other common respiratory viruses, although COVID is not a respiratory virus inherently because of its effects in other parts of the body. It's more of a systemic virus, although it's transmitted through the respiratory route, or specifically airborne, to be specific. Typically, when one virus is dominant, other viruses tend to decrease in the proportion of the population. And then after, when that virus declines, we tend to see increases. So for example, when we see this flu wave, and I'll narrow it down eventually, but this is fine for now. When we had this flu wave come down, we did not have a large amount of COVID circulating, Although there's still a substantial amount of COVID circulating at the time, it wasn't anything like the summer wave. As we see for the summer wave, when we had this large increase in COVID over the summer, last summer, the rhinovirus concentrations decreased very quickly. But after COVID wave started subsiding, going down, and we had a low period, the rhinovirus surged up. And then at this same point, influenza was able to surge up as well as RSV. But RSV was crushed by this influenza wave that came later after it. So RSV was able to get an initial peak within December, but then the flu was able to rise quickly and stop it from getting any higher. So then you see this decrease here. Now, we could see similar patterns in previous seasons where we had a COVID wave. Well, for example, Omicron, I think, is the best example of this. You have a very large COVID wave here, and then flu is suppressed. And then when COVID goes down, the flu went up. There's not the same relationship necessarily in 2023. However, you had RSV go up, and then influenza transmission kicked up. RSV was crushed. This is the same general feedback. When one virus is very dominant, the other ones tend to decrease in prevalence, which is also mentioned in this Wikipedia article down here when it's mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic. Typically, at least as right now, with respect to other HIV and respiratory enteroviruses, which was us evidently affected during the pandemic, an apparent interplay between these and SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused COVID-19, possibly mediated by viral interference, was identified in some places such as California and South Korea. Although these viruses continue to circulate at near pre-pandemic levels, they were found to peak when SARS-CoV-2 activity was low and to decline when SARS-CoV-2 activity was increased, which is generally what we see in this graph here. When COVID-19 transmission is high, although this is positive test percentage, this is not total infected, but when COVID-19 is usually higher as a percentage of the population, the virus that causes it, usually other viruses are lower. But when COVID-19 decreases, we see an increase in other viruses afterward. Same thing with RSV, same thing with influenza. So a large reason behind why this influenza wave was so large is because the other infectious diseases like COVID-19, RSV, and the various common cold viruses, they weren't as prevalent this year coming into the winter. So influenza was able to capitalize on that and take advantage. So while there were common cold viruses like HMPV that were circulating pretty widely in the fall, COVID-19 had a very large summer wave. Because of the amount of people they infected over that time, they weren't able to really maintain that transmission in the winter, and flu was able to overtake them. So coming down here, as for the disease outlook and looking 2024-25 disease outlook, looking back on the season, the prediction for what was likely to happen was not necessarily that the flu would be as severe as it was. The flu season, according to the CDC's analysis, differs substantially from their assessment that the influenza peak would be similar to previous years. What they got right was RSV and COVID-19 had similar, although in this case they had less high peaks than they did in 2023 and 2024. If we can remember, in 2023-2024, the COVID-19 wave that we had was caused by JN1, which was an offshoot variant of BA2.86, which was a divergent variant that was very different from circulating variants before it, and that's what gave us the second highest COVID-19 transmission wave of the pandemic so far in the United States. And then after that, we had a large summer wave. So by the time we entered the winter of 2024-2025, there weren't as many people who were able to be infected by the virus because so many people have already been infected over the past year. Now, when we had influenza, with that out the way, and RSV being generally lower after its relatively high peak last year, now there's a lot less space competition that was impeding influenza this year. And in combination with HN1 and H3N2 circulating at the same time, which are somewhat known to be more severe and infectious. No, not somewhat known. They are known to typically be more infectious and more severe in terms of cases, in terms of caseload, right? This gave the flu the ability to produce a season like this. In addition to, you could possibly attribute, okay, maybe in the earlier years of the pandemic, people were not being infected with the flu at the same rate, so more people are being infected now, because the average infection rate for flu is usually 8 to 9, is usually around 5 to 10 years. On average, when you have the flu, you know you have it because it feels very unique. But with that hypothesis, you can extrapolate. There's a large amount of people who haven't had the flu before, and then who haven't had the flu recently, and in addition to all the other main viruses being suppressed this year because they had high transmission earlier, this would make sense why you have a large flu peak here. But this will also make sense why, because we had a large flu peak here, there won't be as many people in this upcoming season that could produce a wave like this, but we have to see. So the COVID-19 scenario, they have this here. So they had two scenarios, one where scenario A and scenario B. So they had two scenarios. Scenario A, peak COVID-19 hospitalization rate was 7.2 and 9.7 per 100,000. This scenario was that you didn't have a super large summer wave. So this was similar to 2023, 2024, where you have a summer wave that's not as large, that's not very large, but it helps segue into the winter wave where you have a divergent variant that comes along, and then you get very high infection rates and hospitalization rates, right? Not very high hospitalization rates like flu, because COVID-19 circulation throughout the population is much more rampant than flu, so the immune landscape is very different. But that was one possible scenario. That did not happen. What happened was we had a large summer wave where we had multiple waves that, not multiple waves, but multiple different variants that evolved off of JN1 that followed in quick succession, a variant soup as we like to call it, that produced a large summer wave that in fact had at peak around 900,000 to 1 million infections per day and tapered off in the fall. And then we had a winter wave that was smaller than the previous winter wave and around the size of the 2023 summer wave, a little bit smaller. This is where it is relative. So COVID-19 earlier this year, was less prevalent. So with RSV also down, like that gave the flu more space, even though there wasn't the expectation that the flu would be so severe, right? So looking at it, for influenza, experts estimated the moderate confidence that VE, vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization, would be likely 30 to 50%. This is roughly true. The vaccine wasn't really any less effective than usual, but with the combination of events that did happen, I do also have to look at the genetic mix-up of these particular H1N1 and H3N2 combinations for this year. But with that combination, slight genetic change there with the lower presence of other viruses, that helped create what we saw here. And this and high severity flu seasons typically happen usually every 8 to 10 years. The last one was 2017, 2018. There were more before that, but they don't happen very often. But when they do, they tend to be quite destructive. So, wrapping that up as we move closer, although these are somewhat important to what we've had before, but as you can see, the death wave for this influenza wave, goes very high. It's very sharp compared to these ones. And then it comes down very quickly because of the amount of people infected. But in general, as we can see, influenza in general has had a large wave this year, coming off of a low summer, which it normally has. And then as you can see here, I have both COVID and flu on here. When in 2022-23, had a large COVID wave that peaked after influenza peaked, and then it stayed that way stayed high and elevated. And this is one reason why COVID's not the flu. Because during the summer, it has a consistent hospitalization rate. The flu does not have this. So this is exactly why the high peaks are not as high for COVID, because the amount of people it's infecting consistently throughout the year keeps somewhat of a lid on the severity. Not because the virus is any milder, but just because the immune landscape does not support high severity. Or rather, the immune landscape has been trained enough and has seen the virus enough to the point where, yes, it's killing around a higher percentage of flu because it's infecting more people, but the actual rate is not higher at peak times because enough people have already been infected, so they're less likely to die in the acute stage, even if they're more likely to develop long COVID after multiple infections, for example. So for flu, we can see these sharp peaks, waves, but usually over the past 2 years, COVID-19 has been high enough so where these waves, these are normal, generally moderate severity, but they come down pretty quickly. This one came down pretty quickly, but it was able to achieve a higher rate because there's not as much competition for it. And that's the general idea behind why this flu season was more severe. It's a combination of this H3N2, H1N1, both in relatively high concentration. This mix up across the board, which I can't explain that well, right? But then low interference from other viruses, and then you can also count in the lower infections from flu over the early years of the pandemic contributing to this, and then you can get a year with this type of severity where you have an estimated amount of deaths, which I believe are up here somewhere, estimated 27 to 1 to 30,000 deaths and this many infections. So that's the general idea of why flu season was so severe. But in the future, I do want to create a video where we go more in depth onto, okay, what were the actual strains that helped get us these numbers? And then when we get to November, I'll make a second video about this when we get the full estimates, the final estimates from the CDC. And then we'll review next flu season, start preparing and review for next flu season, and we'll see what happens. Alright guys, thank you for watching this video. This video will likely not go up today. Today is the 15th for me still. This video will probably go up tomorrow or will go up sometime this weekend. But I hope you enjoyed and I hope this video was informative to you. These videos don't really need editing. They just really need me to talk and just to generally explain what's going on in the most succinct way I can possibly say it. So I thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day and see you another time. Thank you for being here. Goodbye.